Well done for staying with me if you've worked through all of the videos and got to this one. Now you have a project that is nearly designed. So what you've done so far is you've got yourself a research question. You know that that research question has not yet been answered. You know that that research question would give you a valuable answer to the counselling community. You've got a method. You know what you're going to be doing with your participants, or if you're doing a systematic review, you know what that's going to look like. You've got your research design. You know what your design's going to be like, how it's going to be in terms of quantitative, qualitative, independent variables, covariables, dependent variables, control variables, all of those things. You know who your sample is, and you know that you have the expertise to be able to work with those participants and do what you need to do. You know what your measures are going to be. You know what equipment you need. You've got a pretty solid understanding of your research project now. And at any of those stages, maybe you went back to the start and had to make changes because you realized that it just wasn't going to work. But you've got to where you've got now, and now you are finalizing some of the design elements. So I want to take a moment to talk about questionnaires, the nuances of a questionnaire, because in many cases you're going to use a questionnaire. Maybe you're doing an entire questionnaire study, so obviously you're going to use a questionnaire, but maybe you're doing an intervention where you're going to have a pre-measure and a post-measure. Those are probably going to be questionnaires. Or maybe you're going to do an interview, but you're going to start with a questionnaire to get your consent form and your demographics and find out when your participants are available, that kind of thing, and that will be a questionnaire. I've already talked to you before about the benefits of doing online questionnaires rather than hard copies and making sure the system you use for questionnaires is appropriate. So I'm not going to go through that again. I want to focus now on how you create your questionnaires. First of all, every single question in your questionnaire has to be relevant to your study. I know you're sitting there going, well, duh. I mean, why else would it be there? But come on. So many times we look at questionnaires and there's all these questions that are not even mentioned in the research question or the hypotheses. And they're like, but why are you asking the participant all of these questions? Ethics panels do not like you to waste participants' time. If it's not in your hypotheses and it's not a relevant question and it's not part of your study, then why are you asking it? So for every single question in your questionnaire, you're going to ask yourself, which of these three does that question fit into? Category number one, it is a question to identify whether this is an appropriate person to do the questionnaire in the first place. So for instance, age. You're going to want to exclude anybody who's under the age of 18 unless you are specifically doing a study on children. So if you've got a question on age, yes, that needs to be in there because you need that as part of your exclusion criteria. You need to put that right at the start so they don't fill in a load of additional questions and waste their time if you're going to kick them out the study anyway. There might be other exclusion criteria questions that you're going to ask. Maybe you're only interested in counselling trainees. Maybe you're only interested in students. Maybe you're only interested in qualified counsellors. Whoever it is, you need to ask those exclusion questions right at the start of your questionnaire, after the consent form, obviously. They consent to participate in the first place. Then you ask these questions. If the answer is not what you need for your study, you exclude them. You kick them out. You don't get them to fill all the rest of the questionnaire in and waste their time. So you need the questionnaire to just flick them to the end and say, I'm sorry, you can't participate. So if your question is an exclusion question, absolutely fine, that can stay. The next questions that can stay is any question that is directly mentioned in your research question and your hypotheses. If you are not directly linking it to those things, it's directly mentioned, shouldn't be in there. So let's imagine your research question is all about the effects of counselling, let's say CBT, on well-being. How does engaging in CBT impact on well-being? And your hypothesis is that doing 6 sessions of CBT will result in higher levels of well-being. Okay, that's fine. I would expect to see questions about CBT, how many CBT sessions you've done, and I would expect to see a measure of well-being. If you've also got a measure of anxiety in there, that shouldn't be there. It's got nothing to do with your hypothesis and your research question. Take it out. If you've got questions about how long have you been doing therapy? How many different therapists have you had? How much do you enjoy the therapy? That's not in there. You simply stated that you were interested in doing CBT for a certain amount of time, and the effect on well-being. You can't now ask a load more questions that don't have any relevance to what you're actually investigating. So you either need to take those questions out or go back to your hypothesis, go back to your research question and amend them so that it does actually all tie together. The third type of question that you can include is your control variables. So the last type of question was all about covariables, independent variables, dependent variables. Now we're going to look at covariables. Control variables. Essentially, there will be some questions that you need to ask to check whether you've got a biased sample. So, for instance, you might want to ask about gender. And that's not because you're particularly interested in gender, but you just want to make sure your sample isn't gender biased. To ask that question, you need to justify why you would expect a bias to actually impact on your results. So you need to go out and do some research, look for a paper that shows that actually well-being and CBT is really impacted by gender. There's research that shows that men respond differently to CBT to women. So if you've got a completely biased sample, that's going to be problematic for your findings. So you need to check whether you've got a biased sample, and therefore you're going to ask the question about gender. So every question needs to either be a question to exclude participants because it's not relevant to your sample, a question that is an independent variable, dependent variable, covariable, or directly relevant to your hypothesis and research question, or a question to enable you to check whether you've got a bias sample, a control question. And in those cases, you need to justify it. You can't just say it is, you need to justify it by explaining the research behind it that makes you think it is. Okay, so that's about the questions you're including. But let's think about the wording of those questions. There's questions that can be very, very sensitive. Some questions are asking really sensitive data. Sex, gender, ethnicity, nationality, these are really sensitive data, particularly if you're going to ask things, to do with people's deepest feelings. So you need to think about the wording of those questions really carefully. Sometimes the wording of questions will be hotly debated. So how to ask about gender, how to ask about sexuality in a way that doesn't exclude anybody and doesn't make assumptions is a really controversial topic. I recommend you don't just go with what you think is the best way to ask the question. There's no evidence base behind your personal preference, and one of your participants reading it might strongly disagree with you and put in a complaint because of the way you've asked that question. Instead, look for some technical guidance that's out there. Advanced HE has a great guide on asking these types of questions, so using that could help you to be able to word questions in a way that has been appropriately researched and checked. What that means then is when you submit your ethics, you can actually say these questions are worded in line with this guidance. And you know that if there's a problem, actually you can refer back to the guidance rather than it being, this is just the way I wanted to ask the question. Do, however, double check that the guidance is up to date. Things change quickly in the world of language, particularly in relation to these sensitive issues. So it's important that you're not looking at guidance from 10 years ago that maybe is completely out of date today. Double check that the guidance is appropriate and current before you start using it. The next thing you want to think about in your questions is whether you're going to use a validated measure or you're going to ask your own questions. And actually, it's okay to ask your own questions. If there's no validated measure for the specific thing you're looking at, don't be afraid to say, I'm going to ask my own questions here. That's okay. That's completely appropriate where there's no validated measure. You just need to double check and make sure that there isn't a validated measure first, because otherwise there's a bit of a question as to why you're doing that. You're also going to want to think about timings. How long does it take to do your questionnaire? No, really, how long does it? Not your rough guess. Oh, I could do this in 10 minutes. How long does it really take? The best way to do this is to test it. Get somebody who doesn't know anything about your questionnaire to try and fill it in. They don't have to answer honestly from the heart, but they do have to read every question, go through every part of it. That'll give you a good sense of how long it would take a real participant. And then add some on top of that. Because remember, you will have participants with different learning needs, different reading speeds. You need to make sure they've got enough time to complete. If you don't have anyone who can do it for you, you can do it yourself. I recommend reading each question out loud. Because since you created the questions, you already know what they say. And when you read them in your head, you tend to read them really, really quick. You just flick through them and you scan read. Whereas if you have to read them out loud and say each thing out loud, you will be much closer to what it will be for a real participant reading it for the first time. So read it out loud and time how long it takes you to do it. That will give you a good sense of whether this is a really unreasonably long questionnaire, because a long questionnaire is more likely to lose participants. So if your questionnaire is going on forever, then think about whether you need to remove some elements in order to get it tighter so you keep your participants. It's better to have fewer questions and more participants than have loads of questions and end up with only one person got to the end. So think really carefully about the length of your questionnaire. Another really important ethical point is whether you will allow people to skip questions. That means that they just don't give some answers. Ethically, you cannot force participants to give you any information. So there has to be a way of skipping questions. The only exception is those first exclusion questions, the kind of questions where you need to know the answers to know whether they can continue or not. Those ones you can have forced choice, they have to answer it. But when it comes to the questions like the measures and asking their opinions and their experiences, and it's not an exclusion question, really you need to give them the chance to not answer it. There's two ways you can do this. One is basically they can't move to the next page without giving an answer. That's problematic because they can move to the next page without giving an answer. So they can just skip and not answer the question at all. That's problematic because what you're going to get is participants sometimes, and don't ask me why they would bother logging on to do it in the first place, but they will. They'll just go flick, 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 flick through the whole questionnaire. And what you'll find is that they don't actually answer most of your questions. That's problematic. Another way of doing it, though, is for every question to give a prefer not to answer option. So in a multiple choice, that can just be the final option is prefer not to answer. If you've got a Likert scale with columns, so strongly agree, so on and so forth, the last column is prefer not to answer. And if you've got an open question with a text box, you can have that they have to put something in it, but that they can just put prefer not to answer in it. So you could have a little section that says, if you do not want to answer this question, just write prefer not to answer. If you want to keep it simpler, you can say, if you do not want to answer this question, just put X. That means that they have to read the question and engage with it in some way, but if they don't want to share that information, they're not forced to. So you are meeting the ethics while avoiding the risk of somebody just flicking through everything and not really reading it, because they'd have to read it. And if they've read it and they're going to engage with it anyway, they more than likely will give the actual answer rather than just flicking on to the next question. If you do offer the opportunity to omit questions, though, or skip items, or skip questions, or prefer not to answer questions, you're going to end up with missing data. That means you're going to need to think about what you're going to do with missing data. What if you've got a Likert scale with lots of items and a couple of them just have no answer? How are you going to calculate the overall score? What if they don't answer some key questions? What are you going to do? In some cases, you can just exclude that participant, but if there's loads of them, how are you going to exclude them all? So this means you need to go back and look at those measures and you need to read the original papers again. What did they recommend that you do with missing data? That will probably give you some guidance, and then you can pre-plan, you can think ahead about how you're going to manage that missing data. In some cases, it won't. In some cases, you won't get any guidance on how to manage the missing data. It won't tell you. And so you now need to have a really good think about what you're going to do in that situation. Maybe you're going to put in some substitute data. That's a legitimate stats practice. So if there's a missing item, a missing answer, you basically take the average of all the answers that they have given and you add that average in. So you substitute some data. If you're not familiar with substituting data, and this is a bit sort of gobbledygook and you're a bit confused by this, then what I recommend is that you go away and do some research into this if you have those kinds of questions in your study, because you do not want to leave it to the end. You want to know how you're going to manage missing data right now while you're designing it, because it could make a difference to how you ask your questions. So look into it now, get a sense of what you're going to do going forward, chat with your tutor if you need to, but get your head around what you're going to do with missing data at this stage so that you know exactly how you're going to handle it. The other thing you're going to need to consider is reverse scoring. So, reverse scoring happens in questionnaires when you perhaps have a Likert scale. So, maybe the strongly agree is a 5, strongly disagree is a 1, but you have items that are opposite to each other. Rather than someone just going strongly agree, strongly agree, strongly agree, just answering strongly agree all the way down, sometimes you will have items that are complete opposites to catch people out so they can't do that. So I love research and I hate research. Maybe those two, you can't strongly agree to both unless you've got a weird love-hate relationship with research. But generally, you would strongly agree to one, strongly disagree to another. And you might have other items that have reverse scoring requirements. If you're not sure about reverse scoring, go back to your research classes, reread all of the content that you've got on research in terms of reverse scoring, and get your head around that now. Please don't leave it till the end. A lot of electronic questionnaire systems, online questionnaire systems, actually have automatic reverse scoring if you tell it which items are reversed. So it can be done automatically to save you a lot of time come analysis. But if you leave it till the end to try and figure that out, it'll be too late. It's already been designed, it's already got the data. So get your head around it now. How do you reverse score that data? Which brings me to my final point, my final recommendation for doing these questionnaires and indeed for doing all of your data. Pre-analysis. Pre-analysis is basically where you do a practice run of analysing your data. I know that sounds weird, and in real research we don't do that, but it's a way for you as a trainee, as someone who is learning research, to sort of get your head around what you're going to be doing when you do your actual study, when you've got real data from participants. So let's imagine you've finished your questionnaire, you've got your questionnaire study, it's all written up and done. I recommend that you fill in that questionnaire 20 times. If you're working in a team, you can split that between you, but essentially you fill it in properly. I don't mean answers from the heart, because obviously they'd all be the same, but you read each question and go through it properly. That means you can time it. It means that you can check that there are no errors in there. If you go through that 20 times, you're going to spot a lot of the errors, so you'll be able to correct them. You then download the data. That gives you 20 pieces of data to be able to work with. You can then go through the process of cleaning that data, making sure that you've sorted out any missing data, reversed questions, anything that needs doing. That means you've got your head around how that all works. And chances are you'll spot a mistake. You'll spot something you should have asked, a different way you should have done this question, an error somewhere in it. And you can correct it before it ever gets to your participants. Once you've done that, you analyse that data. You analyse it, putting it through whatever methods you're planning on using to analyse correlations, ANOVAs, t-tests, regressions, whatever you're planning on doing, you analyse that data. And in analysing it, you ask yourself, have I now addressed my research question? If you haven't, you've got a real problem when it comes to your real data, because you're not going to be able to address your research question when you write your discussion. So you're going to go back and look at whether you need to ask different questions, whether you need to change something in your method, or all the way back to the beginning and change your original research question. So we want to get you thinking about what that outcome's going to look like right now and getting that process nailed. In an ideal world, you'll write step-by-step instructions to your future self. Trust me, your future self will want to give you the biggest hug and kiss if, when you come to get your actual data from your real participants, you've got step-by-step instructions on how you clean the data, how you process the data, and how you analyze the data. And you can do that. You can give yourself those step-by-step instructions by doing this pre-analysis. So I strongly encourage you, once you have designed everything and everything is done, do a bit of pre-analysis. Really easy to do with questionnaires. You just fill in the questionnaire a few times. Not so easy with interventions, but you can fake it, fill in the pre-questionnaire, pretend you've done the intervention, fill in the post-questionnaire a few times so that you can do those measures. If you're doing interviews, you could even, if you're in a research team, interview each other and just have a quick practice asking and answering the questions. Do a recording, try transcribing it, try looking at how you would begin to think about themes. Just going through that process can be incredibly valuable. So get yourself thinking now about what the analysis will look like rather than leaving it until you've actually got your data.